Hey, detoxers! As free speech gets rebranded as a threat and journalism is treated like a crime, we're diving into America's authoritarian drift with Project Censored's Mickey Huff. Mickey Huff, welcome back to the Disinfo Detox.
Nolan Higdon, it is an honor to be on with you at Disinfo Detox, and my goodness, where to even begin with the attacks on the press, the importance of press freedom. We'll try not to drift into the realm of cliches, but uh, you know, we really need a radical and independent free press right now. The more than ever part is the cliche part, but I mean, as we look around, First and Fourth Amendment rights crumbling about, separation of powers crumbling, checks and balances failing willy nilly, and the Fourth Estate, of course, is unfortunately not just lining up to fail, but it's also in the crosshairs, which means it's even more important that it doesn't fail. And you and I would say that even though we are critics of the corporate media, it does not pleasure us in any degree to see any political party weaponize attacks against the press in general. It's you would think that it would be beneath people that would be leaders of a country like ours. But if you go back far enough, as you and I do as historians, Jefferson and Adams had a few little spats going on in the newspapers of the day. So we're not going to be pining for the antiquity fallacies. But yeah, we've got our work cut out for us. So
Yeah, and let's get started there because that is something that I do reflect on, and I know you do as well as someone with a history brain, where we look back at these episodes in history where it seems like a U.S. president has consolidated power, and maybe they overread their so-called mandate and go after the press, and so I do think we're in one of those moments, and I wanted to have you on because you wrote a really great article about this, one of the dispatches from Project Censored titled All Governments Lie. And you talk about the need right now for a press to challenge power, how we need a press that doesn't echo power but challenges it. And you talk about how it's inspired by I.F. Stone, which I also want to bring up. You're hosting the I.F. Stone's Izzy Awards up there at Ithaca College as well. So why don't you kind of lay out the op-ed for folks and then tell us how it is in the tradition of I.F. Stone?
yeah, thanks, Nolan, for the opportunity. This is certainly common ground for you and I, with our intersections of history and journalism, the importance of First Amendment history, something you and I have written about in several books and articles and been rehashing over and over in many of our classes. This piece was called All Governments Lie, sort of the quote from one of the great muckraking journalists of the 20th century, I.F. Izzy Stone. Why we need a radical and independent free press now. Stone once quipped that if the government makes a mistake, the newspapers will find out and the problem may be fixed. But if freedom of the press were lost, the country would soon go to pieces. And riffing on one of our more favorite Lao Tzu quotes, if you're not careful, you'll end up where you're heading. Are we there yet? Right, as you and I often said after the United States of Distraction book and Media Manipulation and Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It, where we outlined the half-century sort of decline in the public sector, whether it's media, education, etc., and the prices we were paying for it, and some of the prescriptions of what we could do to change it, to reverse those trends, right? And here we are. We ended up where we were heading, have been heading. And in this piece, I talk a little bit about the intersections of both Project Censored and the Park Center for Independent Media, where I'm now also the distinguished director at Ithaca College. And the intersections of both Stone and Project Censored are interesting because I.F. Stone was an early proponent of Carl Jensen and Project Censored, as was Walter Cronkite, Hugh Downs, reform activists like Ralph Nader. Project Censored goes back nearly 50 years. It's 49 years this year. And Project Censored has been calling attention to the institutional systemic shortcomings of corporate media in hopes of improving their writing and reporting about what's going on. This is SPJ's Code of Ethics Week. You and I happen to be talking during that week. I think every week should be Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics Week. And this is sort of what Carl Jensen was thinking about when he started Project Censored, right? And this is certainly what Izzy Stone wrote about in his weekly for more than 20 years, right? He wrote about the things that he believed strongly in that the establishment press should be covering, but often weren't. And if they did, they didn't do a great job of it. Carl Jensen went on to talk about what the media were covering instead of important stories, because he was critiquing the press. But let's be fair, he was trying to be constructive. He wasn't trying to tear it down. There's a very significant difference between the kind of criticism that media scholars and independent journalists levy at the establishment press and ideological partisan hacks like Donald Trump, who weaponize fake news and attack people. And let's not forget the Democrats' role in some of that. And let's not also forget that the Democrats wanted to curate this kind of information with a disinformation governance board and the rest. This is a bipartisan assault on the press in different ways. But again, we want to differentiate. When we criticize the press, it's because we know it can do better. And not only that, and they prove it. The New York Times and ProPublica, when they team up, they do amazing reporting. When we see some of the best reporters at the Washington Post let free of Bezos' hand, they could report on a lot of amazing and important things. But they also have consistent built-in shortcomings that we talk about through the propaganda model, the pressures of ownership and advertising, elite sourcing and flack and ideological biases. Those are all issues. Now we deal with algorithms and shadow banning and a raft of other potential censorious issues. But this is why, and again, Carl Jensen wasn't around for the latter part of that stuff. Peter Phillips, the second director of the project, and then I came in with Andy Lee Roth 15 years ago, to really hone that message and bring it up to the present. What we're calling for still is an intrepid press that goes after those in power to hold them accountable in the public interest. Unfortunately, when the so-called mainstream press fail to do that and get sucked into the narrative as they've done in the three-ring circus here of Team Red, Team Blue, and where the media happen to lie in that spectrum, they've been pulled into the fake news epithet. They've been pulled in sort of as a player rather than an observer, and that's part of the problem. But it's in the independent press that we really can see consistency historically, speaking truth to power, not just in a way that's abstract, but where speaking truth to power is the power. The Fourth Estate holds that power to hold those people accountable in the name of the public. And that's what we talk about in this piece. We talk about sort of the state of the free press, but we talk about why we need an independent press. This is what we acknowledge at the Izzies every year. This year, we're recognizing Steve Mellon of Pittsburgh Union Progress and Max Alvarez of the Real News Network for their reporting on East Palestine and the tragic train derailment after the corporate media sort of did their circus Hollywood coverage. They kind of packed up and left. What's still going on in these so-called sacrifice zones? Well, the independent press tells us that. San Francisco Public Press, another winner of the Izzy this year, reporting on Hunters Point and the U.S. Navy experimenting on minority, largely African-American community there without their knowledge for years, right? That kind of reporting. Jewish Currents reporting about other sacrifice zones from Gaza to civil liberties and the weaponization of anti-Semitism here, right? So we, both at the Park Center and at Project Censored, we don't just critique what's going wrong in the corporate media. We also highlight the best of the independent reporting in the vein of someone like I.F. Stone, right? So that we can show people around us that there is journalism happening in the public interest, but we do have to be media literate in order to find it.
Okay, and I want to add something to our conversation here that I've been thinking about, because you brought up kind of the history before this. And as we know, I think a lot of folks are so focused on the present, they don't look back at the past to realize how we got here. And I know you always use that Lao Tzu quote about, be careful where you're heading, you might end up there, right?
Yeah.
So I want to just remind our audience of a couple examples of why I'm going to ask this question. We saw that Ramisa Öztürk was arrested on the street. This was a Turkish citizen who was here on a visa, presumably was arrested by ICE for writing an op-ed that the establishment of the Trump administration disagreed with. Mohammed Khalil from Columbia University was a Palestinian American student, was very active in the protests around Israel's actions in Gaza, and was a legal permanent resident, but was arrested as well. And then most recently, the nation has been captivated by the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's deportation. It was a lawful U.S. resident, mistakenly deported by immigration services of the Trump administration. Now is in an El Salvadorian prison where the courts are telling Trump the Trump White House, they have to facilitate the return. Trump is playing games with the El Salvador president, saying this person cannot return. And now the judge is trying to put pressure on Trump to return this U.S. resident. So these are some of these recent examples that are in the news media. But I want to look at sort of the history of this, because one of the things I notice lecturing on history, and I'm sure you agree with this, is especially as we go through, like, say, starting the War on Terror years, but maybe even earlier,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes obvious that there were opportunities to stop this type of behavior before it got to this point. And I'm thinking of the cases of, Edward Snowden, for example, or if we had held, say, the Bush administration liable for the torture scandal, or we held the Obama administration liable for the drone program. A lot of these types of things, had we done it back then, wouldn't be dealing with it today. I wonder what you kind of think about, and do you see those kind of parallels about missed opportunities over the last, say, 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely, Nolan. And you and I, of course, cataloged some of these in several of our publications, some that we've mentioned already. Certainly at Project Censored, we've been sort of on this, championing those that show what Daniel Ellsberg, the late, great Daniel Ellsberg, called civil courage, right? And specifically, that was manifest in upholding the brave whistleblowers that go to journalists and tell those stories. You go back some 55 years, and you go back to Dan Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Let's remember that Ellsberg was at the Rand Corporation. He was a supporter of the Johnson era war in Vietnam that escalated beyond the Laos and Cambodia. The conscience ended up getting the better of him when he repeatedly discovered how many lies and deceptions were unfolding, and the great cost of it, right? Not just financial cost, but the human cost, the cost to the country's conscience, etc., was pretty heavy. And so he decided to leak these documents, and Nixon happened to be president at the time, and because Nixon was the way he was, power freak, paranoid in some ways, he really went to town and made sort of drew a line in the sand about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. At the time, the New York Times still had a spine, and they sided with Ellsberg, and they went to the Supreme Court and ended up winning a case over the right of him to leak and tell the public what's really going on. To paraphrase George Seldes, another great muckraker from In Fact of the 40s and 50s, going back in the 20th century, we have plenty of examples, both of whistleblowers and intrepid journalists exposing corruption and exhibiting civil courage. But we also have these signposts, as you mentioned. We had the Edward Snowdens, we had the Julian Assange, we had the Thomas Drake, we had the
Chelsea Manning.
yeah, we had all these, the Chelsea Manning, we had the Mark Klein, who recently passed away, the AT&T whistleblower, years before Ed Snowden, talking about AT&T having duplicated files for the NSA during the first Bush administration. I'm sorry, during George W. Bush's second administration, when he convinced the Times to cover the story up for a year and not cover that. But we can keep going back even further when we play this game. We can go back to attacks on the press during the Reagan years, for sure. The Nixon years we've already mentioned, where, through the brilliant writing of William Safire, out of the mouth of Spiro Agnew, this press were the nattering nabobs of negativism, that alliteration there. Those attacks on the press became really part of the GOP and part of the establishment really lashing out when they tried to hold parties accountable. And there too begins the myth of the liberal media during the Nixon years that became so much of a cash cow that fueled Rush Limbaugh's hate-filled AM radio diatribes for decades, that they took over the whole AM sphere after the collapse of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 and the Telecom Act of 1996 that allowed for it. We can keep going back further. You want to go back to these grabbing people off the streets. We were doing that after World War I and the A. Mitchell Palmer raids and the Soviet Ark. I mean, this country has a unfortunately despicable history of not tolerating these different views. And let's not forget who was being round up: immigrants, labor activists, people that brought us the weekend, people that brought us worker safety, people that were opposed to child labor. Hello, Florida. Now looking to fill the gaps of, now that they're going to kick immigrants out, they have to have kids working in these jobs. I mean, this is just preposterous. It's like we're in a time machine heading back to the Gilded Age faster than, we're getting whipsawed back to it. Meanwhile, in the corporate media, we celebrate, vapid, faux, pink-washed feminist dildos going into space for 11 minutes and acting like it's some major accomplishment for Katy Perry. Again, it's exhausting what complete nonsense that we still suffer in the so-called mainstream with junk food news, nonstop news abuse propaganda, New York Times telling us words reporters aren't allowed to use to report on things happening in Gaza. I mean, you couldn't make up a more dystopian script if you tried, and it is a reality with a reality TV president. And so it's really important, Nolan, that we contextualize historically these issues to show A, that they're not technically new in our history, but B, they didn't end well. These are embarrassing moments in the history of the United States where we failed to live up to our principles extraordinarily. So much so that people like you and people like me, when we teach history, we look at those signposts not to gloat and say, I told you so, or and again, the way the right depicts this is absurd, that we hate America. I'm sorry. I did not dedicate a better part of my adult life living in this country telling people how we can make it a better place because I hate it. That's absolutely a trope that must be resisted and denied at every turn, because the reason we tell these stories isn't because of hatred. It's because of a love of these core principles that we unfortunately see failing around us, because those of us that like to stand up for it don't have enough voice. We have to be in solidarity. We have to speak out and support the independent press and people. Again, you and I could go down a list of things the corporate media don't do well, but I will also stand in line and protect them when they are attacked with a broad brush that is designed to destroy the free press in this country. And believe you me, if they can get away with attacking the major media outlets and sue them into oblivion, the independent press is doomed. Right. And we need to remember that. We need to stand up against the attacks against nonprofit public interest media under HR 9495. We need to stand up against attacks at universities. When we see Columbia capitulating, that's not something to celebrate. Could we attack Harvard for their 50-some billion-dollar endowment and the fact that they might be capitulating? We could. But you know what? They actually, even if in tepid fashion, they have recently stepped forward and said, you know what? Academic freedom and independence is worth a price. It's worth paying something. And maybe it's worth foregoing these federal funds, right? To actually stand up for these principles. And I don't know if you've seen this. I know just before you and I got on, I just saw a message from President Trump. I think it's on Truth Social. And I mean, look, it's hard to even believe that this is someone that's president of the United States when you read the things that either he or one of his handlers is tweeting on his behalf. I mean, it's absolutely riveting that he says Harvard's lost its way. They talk about the worst and most incompetent mayors in history from New York and Chicago. I don't know what that has to do with Harvard per se. But then he talks about radical left mayors that left their state. Again, still nothing about Harvard. But then he goes on to talk about how these people they're only capable of teaching failure to students. I mean, it's absolutely riveting. He talks about how these people and teachers should be fired. I mean, he calls them leftist dopes. I mean, again, you and I wouldn't refer to the leaders of the neoliberal university as leftists at all. If anything, they're neoliberal stooges, right? But he gets away with this egregious framing and egregious language. And again, you and I have our critiques of the Ivy League, having taught on the community college level, the state level, but these kind of attacks are the kind of things that we have to stand up against, because it's not just an attack on Harvard, it's an attack on intellectualism. Don't forget that Trump is the guy that said we love the poorly educated. He's dismantling in a controlled demolition style with, Mrs. Wrestling Lady, who thinks it's called what is it called? AI is called A1, the steak sauce.
Oh, the Linda McMahon.
Yeah. AI development. I mean, how can we educate at the speed of light if we don't have the best technology around, to do that? I I think it was a letter or a report that I heard this morning. I wish I could remember the source, but that there is a school system that's going to start making sure that first graders or even pre-Ks have A1 teaching, every year starting, that far down. So it wasn't all that long ago that we're going to have internet in our schools. Woo! Now, okay, let's see A1 and how can that be helpful? How can it be helpful in one-on-one instruction? How can it be helpful in absorbing, more information for those fast learners?
And I mean, it's just riveting what we're living in. We're literally living in a reality show called Idiocracy. And I think that we really need to stand against these attacks. Even if we have critiques of the Ivy League, we can't allow this kind of attack on intellectualism to stand.
Yeah, and as you're talking about that attack on intellectualism, it reminds me of something I've kind of noticed recently, and especially in this manosphere podcast space, where a lot of these oligarchs, like Mark Andreessen, or these openly anti-democracy tech bros like Curtis Yarvin, they've been
Yarvin,
saying,
for sure.
yeah,
Should be a household name for how completely demagogic and dystopian he is, but most people don't know him.
Yeah, and he's very influential, especially to folks like JD Vance and a lot of the big tech folks. But what I find interesting about their perspective, let's call it, Yarvin is talking about how this is the end of democracy, but he means that as a good thing. It's the end of humans with all their errors controlling government. It's going to be handed over to tech and tech bros. And then I think it was Andreessen, maybe it was another one of the oligarchs. I'm mixing up all these white rich people. But he mentioned something about how like FDR was a dictator.
About a lot is Curtis Yarvin, who's also a good friend of mine, and the way he describes the American system that's running the people, the way he describes it is we are living under FDR's personal monarchy, 80 years later without FDR.
And in both of these cases, it reminded me of something that I know you do in the classroom, you and I have written about, and others have written about, whether you go back to Bornstein or Berman with the Twilight of American Culture,
yes,
which is they eroded civics and history and education. And there was a lot of people ringing the alarm bells at the time, like democracy is going to fall apart if you do this, the civil society is going to fall apart. And they were kind of laughed at as tinfoil nuts, myself included. But I think here we are living in that moment. Only with an ahistorical understanding of the world could you seriously say that democracy is a bad system for the United States, or we're living in FDR's dictatorship. Only someone with no history knowledge could say that. And I think that's why these oligarchs are getting away with this in these spaces, and why they're so popular amongst people who desperately need democracy. Poor and working people are siding with these oligarchs. But I think it's because they have no civics knowledge. And they're ahistorical. But, what do you think in kind of your experience as you see these narratives coming from the oligarch class?
Well, Nolan, you hit the nail on the head squarely. We live in a sort of an ahistorical vacuum where people somnambulistically bump around, ships passing in the night, colliding in the night, talking over each other, expounding, forever on cable television news in particular, and in social media, people going on and on and on about things where they have no real background or context to sort of ground them. As Gore Vidal said, we live in the United States of amnesia, but I'll take it a step further. You can't forget something that you never learned. I was just asking my class the other day about whether or not they had civics in high school and what kind of civics education they learned, and did they learn about No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top while they were like products of it. And a majority of the class said no. And then the history was boring because of how it's taught. I'm like, well, that's the thesis of James Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me. History is important, but it's not being taught in the right ways. And oftentimes it's because we're strangulating the classroom and the educational process, not giving teachers the opportunity to talk about these things. The whole teaching to the test model that has shown itself to be a gross failure over the last couple of decades. Again, we've been heading here, right? Daniel Borston, the historian in the 60s, warning us about pseudo events and how we'll be easily propagandized. Going back even further, Eddie Bernays talking about how he says we should be propagandized from elite experts and people like this. Well, we've arrived, right? And we haven't arrived in style. We've arrived in desperation. We've arrived in moral panics. We've arrived with pearl clutching as we're now closer than 2 minutes to midnight on the atomic clock. We have multiple imperial wars going on around the country, and now we have a president that wants to take us back to the McKinley years, and he wants to go back to the A. Mitchell Palmer age. You mentioned Mahmoud Khalil being round up. Basically, they basically are saying, the Associated Press has reported that the government isn't even saying that there's any criminal conduct. Khalil's a legal permanent resident. His wife's 9 months pregnant. He basically was an activist for protesting what was happening in Gaza. And then Secretary of State Rubio claims that he can be expelled for his beliefs. Let's just focus on that for a second. You mentioned the Tufts University student that was hauled down to Louisiana because of an op-ed they wrote a year earlier. There's another example of a person that was just arrested at a citizenship hearing for something that they were working with Khalil in the protests. You mentioned, of course, the person who has been literally sent, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's just been disappeared in some Kafka gulag in El Salvador, with the president smirking with the head of El Salvador in the White House saying, gee, I just wish I had the power. I don't have anything I can do to get him back out of here, openly defying judicial orders. I mean, the collapse that you and I have talked about and the dangers that we saw coming, they're here. They have arrived. We're not just looking at the distance. We're in it. We're in the constitutional crisis. We are in the crisis of the fourth estate. We are in civil decline. And the only way to reverse it is to acknowledge it, speak out against it, and do everything we can, especially teaching, to help people have that context to understand what exactly it is that we're losing right now. And I don't say that with, again, the antiquity fallacy lens and rose-colored glasses. Things were not perfect in the Great Depression, but Franklin Roosevelt was not a dictator. And the idea that somehow you can take somebody that's the sort of the progenitor of what were called the four freedoms, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of belief, religion, freedom from want and fear, and somehow peddle him as a modern day Mussolini is gross revisionism, the scale on which could only exist if we were living in an ahistorical time, which we apparently are, where people can just throw labels around willy-nilly and just distract people with the shiny things of whatever. It's the space rocket today. What will it be tomorrow? Last week it was Tesla dealerships. I mean, again, it's the fire hose, the flooding the zone that Bannon wanted. Spray enough nonsense and trouble that people can't keep up with it, such that the public loses trust in their institutions and they go running to a tin hat dictator who couldn't point to a constitutional principle if you had it in front of him with a magnifying glass. So this is what we're facing, and it's not just Trump. So don't take this as a rant against Trump. This isn't Trump derangement syndrome. You remember, you and I were just as critical of the Biden administration, of what Harris was doing. We're just as critical of Democrats, like performative experiences from Cory Booker, and et cetera. This is not about, a partisan issue. This is not about right, left, red, blue. It's right and wrong. And it's in front of our faces. And the more it's flaunted, I'm afraid, the more they're showing their hand about where they actually want to go. And it's not pretty, Nolan.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think what you're speaking to there is something worth emphasizing, which is too often we get into party politics or the cult of personality in this country. But principles are really what matter. And so, like, even all these folks, whether they have citizenship or student visas or permanent residency, whatever, the fact they're being rounded up and locked up for things like disagreeing with a foreign country, it just seems like a principle we wouldn't respect, regardless of who the country is. These are the kind of issues I see. Or I've even heard, I don't know if you caught this on one of Joe Rogan's podcasts, but he had some guest on who made the comment that the real villain of World War II was Winston Churchill.
But I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
No one's saying, listen, I listened to some of his stuff and, maybe he shouldn't have said what he said about Winston Churchill, but I think he was just being hyperbolic. And if you just listen to actually what he says about the whole conflict, you kind of get an understanding of who this guy is. And so there was a lot of resistance to having you on, but I was like, fuck that resistance. I know what you actually do. And so that's why we're here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah,
Yeah.
which is completely insane. And I've got plenty of critiques of Churchill, as I know you
Tons.
do. But really, come on, like, is Churchill even in the conversation of the worst villain of World War II? But I saw so many people who are Rogan supporters or Trump supporters like twist themselves in knots to try and justify the comment, where I'm like, don't you just have a principle on this issue? Can we just agree Hitler was the villain? So I think so much of our current politics become stupefied by people's cult of personality around a character like Trump or Biden or Harris, or party affiliation, Republican versus Democrat. Can you speak a little bit to that, about the importance of principles over party, over these cult of personalities?
Yeah, absolutely, Nolan. That is exactly what we refer to when we talk about the importance of the free press or protections of privacy. These have to be paramount issues that involve and apply to everyone, not just whom the people in power decide get rights as privileges. I mean, again, this is the kind of thing. This is the kind of thing that I.F. Stone noted about, going back to the Izzies, and why we acknowledge that this kind of important reporting that remembers our principles. And Izzy Stone once wrote that it is time to defend the weak against the strong, to fight for justice, and to seek, as best I can, to bring healing perspectives to bear on the terrible hates and fears of humankind, in the hope of someday bringing about one world in which people will enjoy the differences of the human garden instead of killing each other over them. Those are the words of Izzy Stone, testifying to the importance of these principles, those things that we allegedly go vote for, those things that we passionately, allegedly get into dialogue with our fellow citizens, right? But again, while supporting those kinds of principles, it's important also to remember another great quote from I.F. Stone, where we started, and that's, all governments lie, but disaster lies in wait for countries whose officials smoke the same hashish they give out. I think that in our time, Elon Musk is definitely doing the ketamine that they're doling out. They're definitely indulging a little much on their own propaganda, and it's up for us, the citizenry, to not tolerate it, to push back against it through higher education, supporting academic freedom, supporting the First Amendment and Fourth Amendment rights to privacy. And again, an injury to one is an injury to all. Because I'm not an immigrant, because I'm not a visa holder, because et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because I didn't have that opinion. No, what's happening to these people is wrong. It violates our principles as Americans living in a purportedly free society. And if we don't all condemn it, we'll be next.
Mickey Huff, I could talk to you all day, and basically do most days.
You're right.
But thank you for coming back on the Disinfo Detox. Can you remind folks where they can find your work and follow some of the stuff? Don't forget to mention Park too. So where can they follow some of your work?
Thanks so much, Nolan. You can find us at projectcensored.org, Project Censored Show, every week with Eleanor Goldfield. I do that program. Nolan, you're a regular guest on there, so certainly folks are no stranger to you and your good work. And of course, also parkindymedia.org at the Park Center for Independent Media. We're coming up on the 17th Annual Izzy Awards, April 30th. You can go to parkindymedia.org to learn more. Should be recorded as well as streamed, and looking forward to honoring and celebrating some of the best and brightest independent voices in the independent press. We do need them now, if ever.
Mickey Huff, thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning into the Disinfo Detox.
See you, Detoxers.
Hey, Detoxers. Thanks for tuning in. You can find Disinfo Detox on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share. Every click helps grow the community and keeps those tech overlords happy. Detox complete.